Welcome to Mad About Money. I'm Maddy Alexander-Grout, and this is the podcast where we talk to interesting people all about their interesting money stories. I'm here with Ezra De Wolfe, who is founder of ADHD Tools, and he helps ADHD entrepreneurs to basically organise their systems and processes in their business so that they're not fluffing and failing around all the time. I don't know, that was supposed to be faffing and flailing, not flapping and failing, but whatever.
Yeah,
We're
yeah. I mean,
there.
to confess, Maddie, as soon as you called me an interesting person, I got stuck on that. So
Well,
far
I
I'm loving
wouldn't.
it so far.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have invited you on if you weren't an interesting person. So I have to say, I only ever have interesting people on this podcast because otherwise people wouldn't listen to it and it'd be really rubbish. So, Ezra, tell me a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. So I came to entrepreneurship. So maybe I'll say it this way: I came to successful entrepreneurship later in life, in the same way that I came to an ADHD diagnosis later in life. I think what's fair to say is that I always sort of had this sense inside that although I succeeded in a lot of things in sort of like a corporate world, and like I loved the work, and like I really cared about the results, I was also the type of person that, my God, like if you looked at like how many GoDaddy accounts and like domains I have purchased over life, like it is a shameful amount.
How many do
And
you reckon?
oh my God, probably about 30 different ideas at the
I
time. But like,
I can probably raise you on that to about
oh, okay.
40. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's super common with folks for ADHD. But like I say, I went through most of my early adult life not being aware of ADHD and not sort of being aware of how I got sort of held back. Of sort of I could always get 80% of the way there and things, but it wasn't until an ADHD diagnosis, but more importantly, getting some skills in place that I was able to finally turn some things around. And so that's what I help people do as well now in this part of my journey, is I sort of help people speed up that process and finding the sort of skills and systems they need in their own businesses.
Amazing. So we'll come to your ADHD diagnosis in a bit because I definitely want to know more about that. But the question I ask everybody on this podcast is, what is your money story?
Mm. Yeah, when if I think about some of my first memories about money, I think the first memories I have about money were along the lines of, I find the idea of thinking about money and managing money really difficult.
Mm,
So I better make a lot of it so that I never have to think about the management of money. That was like a thought that I had through certainly my early 20s of like, I don't think I'm going to succeed with this. Can I just can I make enough so I don't have to think about it? Now in retrospect, I can look back on it and say like maybe there's some tendencies I had around ADHD and how that wasn't that wasn't such a great plan. But
yeah.
that was certainly my relationship with money for a long time, was thinking about looking at income as a solution to problems with managing money, which spoiler alert, that's not a great strategy. And
No.
so now later in life, I'm able to help folks who are sort of thinking through some of those things more in a business context of like, how do you think through your business finances? So very complementary to a lot of like what you're doing with this sort of consumer and personal side.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a case where like if you've got problems with money management or you don't understand how money affects you, especially when you've got ADHD, no matter how much money you earn, you're always going to have those same patterns and that same problem. So that it doesn't help people to be there. So what was your early career like?
What was my early career like? Yeah,
Yeah.
so very much that I was always like the big picture thinker. I was always the person who cared very deeply about whatever the outcome did. So I did a lot of work in sort of like change management and project management. And I think I fit into that role very easily because I cared about the outcome. And
Mm.
yet, I also found myself not realizing the ADHD diagnosis as the person who could never like get their monthly expense report done on time. And so when I look at pieces of that, which is quite common for folks with ADHD, I would say that like my skill sets and traits tend to be, I have strong strengths and I have some pretty big weaknesses as well. Like it's a mixture of traits. And I would say that sort of in a corporate setting, I always found myself sort of struggling. I struggled with the fact that I was always so interested in sort of a big picture that sort of hurt at times when other folks around me weren't as equally sort of as invested in that. And I would also say that I struggled in a sense that I would get very, I really struggled sort of fitting into sort of like a lot of the sort of cultural things that I felt were quite out of place with the way that I worked. And so I always had this like challenge of trying to understand myself, that on one hand, I saw myself as a high performer. And on the other hand, man, not a big fan of the endlessly long meetings, not a big fan of talking circles, not a big fan of filling in the expense reports. And I didn't really realize that that's a common, when I look at like a lot of folks who are that I help primarily in my program, they tend to actually be folks who've had a very similar journey to me, of like, they're folks who've worked really well, or sorry, they have a lot of skills, and maybe they worked in the corporate sector for a while, but they have a pattern very similar to me of like changing jobs every few years, not quite feeling like they were getting the most out of themselves, but not understanding that it was largely because of the environment that they were in, as opposed to something that was necessarily inherently wrong with themselves.
I think that's a really, really big kind of takeaway to have from corporate life. I job hopped for, I mean, I kind of came out of university, got a job that was kind of like, just a job. It was never meant to be a career. Then I started my career in recruitment, and recruitment is so cutthroat, and it's very social, and I didn't always want to be social, and I didn't, in the times where I did socialize, I'd drink too much and make an idiot of myself because I was so uncomfortable being in the social situation. I didn't fit in with the working world, but I also didn't get much support from managers. I remember somebody giving me some really bad feedback once, and I cried. And he was like, "Why are you crying? Like, remember this phrase, Maddy. Remember this phrase. I value your feedback. I'll take it on board and I'll grow. And go and think about that." And I just felt like this big. I thought, what a prick. He's a horrible person. He's coming at me with all this horrible negative feedback. Whatever happened to like that shit sandwich where they sandwich something good in the middle of it? ADHDers hate that, by the way. But I always think like, we would have fitted in a lot more in the working world had there been more awareness, but also, had we had more awareness of ourselves. But nowadays, I think there are more managers who are actually taking it on board and learning more about neurodivergent conditions so that they can support their employees. I mean, do you think now that if you were in the working world now and you were employed, do you think you'd get on better knowing that you've had your diagnosis, or do you think it might make it worse?
Yeah, yeah, I certainly think you're getting at something that I think is an important realization that a lot of folks go through after a diagnosis. That
Mm,
one of the things that has maybe held us back in life is not just the sort of neurology of ADHD, not just the sort of like, maybe we have challenges with sequencing, maybe we have challenges with time awareness, with time blindness, but also the sort of like, we were put into environments that don't necessarily get the best out of us, and quite often we
yeah,
also we weren't given the strategies that we might need, because there's lots of ways to succeed when you have ADHD. But often, like in the absence of having those strategies, we can, it can be tough because we find ourselves like hitting a wall of like, we're not sort of having the outcomes we want. So we keep sort of like trying harder, being harder on ourselves. That doesn't work. Going back to like, we'll go to a planner, works, doesn't work, works for a week, doesn't work, be hard on ourselves, not moving forward. When really the challenge was not necessarily just that we had ADHD. It's that we've gone through our whole lives as adults without actually anyone ever helping us sort of understand that there are different ways and better ways of working that can sort of like get the most out of our abilities and skills and talents. And certainly we would want that to be the case for a lot of the corporate world. Why wouldn't we want, if there's multiple ways of doing a task, why wouldn't we want people to be able to do the task in the way that gets the most out of their skills, talents, and abilities? But unfortunately, quite often, um, this comes up against the sort of one size fits most type systems that are far more common. And given the choice between
yeah.
doing the thing that might get the most out of people or maintaining a one size fits most type systems. Sometimes we can, in the corporate world, we might err on the side of preserving that system, even if not
Yeah.
everyone fits neatly into the box.
It's really tough. And I think, even for neurotypical brains, there are differences in how every single last one of us work. We all have different preferences. We all have different ways of learning, different skills and different levels of ability. And I think employers really need to kind of take a bit of a step back and think, if you have a large workforce, are you utilizing your staff to the best of your ability? Are you going to be losing staff if you're not treating them in the right way? I mean, I recently did my neurodiversity in the workplace qualification so that I can support larger corporate organizations to help them to look after their staff better. And I think that kind of the drive for me to do that came from me never fitting in, and actually me thinking now 100% that I'm totally unemployable. I had a spate of jobs in a year. I think I've job hopped like 5 times in a year once, which it made me have the lowest self-esteem. So you don't feel great coming out of that, and you kind of think almost you're pushed towards entrepreneurship or being self-employed because you don't feel like there's any other option. And then that's quite stressful as an entrepreneur because you think, shit, I need to get this right because otherwise I'm going to have to go back to working in a horrible corporate job where I don't fit in and I'm not welcome. So, from that perspective, it's hard being an ADHDer working or in entrepreneurship. I think that's a challenge that a lot of people do face. So what was the kind of icing on the cake that made you go, right, entrepreneurship, that's the way I'm going?
Yeah, yeah. I would say there were two things. So one was I had an experience of trying to access supports in my workplace through sort of an accommodation program, and realizing that the reality of a lot of the accommodation programs is that it was really more set up as sort of a legal check the box type system, as opposed
Yeah,
to genuine sort of thoughts of how do we get the most out of everyone and all of the different ways that they work. But I think the other thing that sort of that clicked for me was actually getting to a spot where I started to learn more skills of how I actually work best, so that I could see that that sort of self-reliance that is sometimes required of entrepreneurship could be a reality. I went through a process that's fairly common with folks when they go through a diagnosis, where you start off and there's sort of intense excitement around the period of being identified or diagnosed with ADHD, because suddenly things fit into, like, our life makes sense. We have an explanation, which for many people then is preceded by a drop, because now we know what is wrong and yet we can't do anything about it. And a lot of folks, and myself included, spent some time sort of like floundering in that spot of realizing that sort of like, okay, well, something is going on. And I wasn't really helped too much with sort of like life tech type things. Like there's things that are helpful. Drinking more water, yeah, absolutely helpful. Trying to use a planner, sure, I suppose, but like the types of strategies that we need to actually put in place in terms of like our workflow might be radically different from what we were doing before. So the thing that really started to click for me was when I started to actually work with other people who had ADHD, and I got to sort of witness how those folks work. I got to see examples of success, and I sort of was able to sort of reframe that, in fact, having ADHD, being ADHD doesn't necessarily mean that I can't succeed at entrepreneurship. I think if we actually look at, if we look at many entrepreneurs and public entrepreneurs, quite often we find out, if you go Googling so many people's names as I've done, you'll find out that those are actually folks who have disclosed that they have ADHD. Or if you look at them kind of closely, you realize like, nah, that person has some ADHD traits, and so
absolutely. And
part
I,
of it
I
was
think
just being able to see those folks, see that there was a solution, that things didn't have to feel hopeless, and that was certainly key for me.
Yeah, there are so many high profile entrepreneurs who have ADHD, so many high profile sports people, actors, and, people who you think, wow, they have been really successful. And the thing is, though, with ADHD and entrepreneurship, if you love what you do, you hyper focus on it. And that's the thing. That's the thing. And the key to all of it, I think, is if you're an entrepreneur and you set out to do something that you don't enjoy, you're never going to succeed at it. So, my first business, I set up a recruitment agency because I'd come out of recruitment and I thought, yes, I'm good at recruitment, I'll do that. But I forgot that I hated it with a passion. It was a horrible industry, it was a horrible job, and, it wasn't for me. So that failed within 6 months. I set up a discount card, which I loved. It was amazing and it did so well until the pandemic. And then the pandemic kind of put the heels in and said, no, you can't do this anymore. So I set up a parenting app, because I had an audience that were parents. I had like 7,000 people in a Facebook group, and I thought, oh yeah, I'll sell to those people because that's what I knew. But I didn't enjoy it, and it wasn't my passion. So, I ended up selling that business. So technically, it was successful, but it wasn't my joy. And now I only do things that I really, really love. And I'm so much happier in my business. I'm so much happier in like my work life. And, I feel like when you're doing that thing that makes you successful, everything else, just kind of fades in comparison, doesn't it, really? So, yeah,
Sure.
that's it.
Yeah. And arguably, I think to succeed in many competitive spaces, you need to actually be able to leverage that sort of intense interest and intense focus that we can sometimes have, that those big picture thinkings, those sort of like being able to spot patterns, being able to learn quickly, the sort of, sort of maybe what we might think of sort of like well-rounded folks might do better in sort of like standardized factory type office settings. That isn't necessarily true when it comes to succeeding in the marketplace. Like, quite often, we don't want our accountant to be somebody who's like well-rounded in many ways, that he's very successful in, I don't know, he's a great golfer, and the person is also like really good at other things. And like, we want somebody to be hyper interested and focused and passionate about the thing that they're actually doing. And that's something where ADHD can be a competitive advantage for a lot of folks, so long as that we also do like something I heard you sort of suggest there in some of your first ventures, that it might have been something that wasn't quite aligned. If you were thinking about
Yes.
like your offer, it might have been a very profitable, it might have looked great on paper, somebody else could have done it well, and it would have been great, but you set up something that wasn't in alignment because ultimately you disliked pieces of it. And like, it can be very difficult for folks with ADHD to succeed in areas where we don't have that sort of alignment. And those little things can be huge differences of not just thinking through a business plan in terms of what's the market conditions, what's the demand, but sort of playing this forward 3 months from now. Alignment can look like things like, am I interested? It can look like things like, does it have sufficient variety? Are we like, does it give us novelty? Does it give us sort of like, does it give us a sense of achievement? All of those things can be quite important in terms of ensuring that ultimately we're successful.
And also looking at the areas that we have as weaknesses, right? So, I mean, I know personally that my weaknesses are admin. Anything that involves receipts or accounts, or
Yeah.
anything that is classed as, in inverted commas, kind of like the boring but, really important things. Sales funnels, lead magnets, emails, no, all of those things that are really, really key to running a business. And that's the sort of thing that your membership can help people with, isn't it? Which, is super useful. Actually getting to grips with like the things in your business that actually are the things that make you kind of two steps behind everybody else.
Sure. Yeah. There's the question of not just managing our time, but managing our energy. So a very common thing for folks with ADHD is, like you say, maybe it's the admin side that they struggle with. That, and myself, if I look at sort of like the customer support side, how much of a day would it take if I did all of it myself? probably only about half an hour each day. But how much of my mental energy would it take if I was to be the person who was in charge of that? Like an intense amount that I can't spare. So I have to think about not just managing the time, but managing sort of the emotional side. And maybe just also like I think the other sort of mindset shift that's quite helpful for folks who have their own businesses with ADHD, of sort of dropping some of the shoulds, of like dropping
Yes.
the should of like, oh, I should be able to do that. Like a great, one of the great advantages that folks with ADHD have in terms of entrepreneurship is that so many of the things that we excel at, the strengths, are things that are very hard to hand over to somebody else. Really hard to hand over that strategic vision. Really hard to hand over the sort of deep understanding of the market. But the admin side, that's super easy to hand over to somebody else. Finding somebody to write your emails, super easy to hand over to somebody else. So like all of the things that tend to be weaknesses tend to be things that if we look at them sort of strategically, they are things that we can mitigate through systems or through processes or through working with a team. But the things that we have that are strengths are things that often are quite unique, and that can't be handed off. So if you really had, like, if you were to design an ideal person to be the head of a lot of operations, I would suggest that there are particular strengths that we have that like the key is to make sure that we're spending our time leaning into those strengths and not spending our time wishing or judging ourselves for some of those weaknesses.
Absolutely. And for anybody who's listening here in the UK, there is a scheme called Access to Work, which helps to support you if you are in work or if you are an ADHD or any other neurodivergent or even with mental health type of entrepreneur. And you can get things like coaching, support, and actually you can get me as a coach, which is pretty good. So, sometimes people like that. I don't toot my horn that often, but my clients seem to quite like me. So, anyway, without me doing too much shameless plugging, let's move on to your diagnosis. You were
Sure.
diagnosed late. What happened?
What was going on? Yeah.
How did you kind of discover that you had ADHD in the first
Yeah,
place?
sure. Yeah, I'd always suspected that I might have ADHD. The flip side is that I'm also autistic, and I think the sort of understanding of ADHD and autism in society isn't it doesn't sort of match the lived experience of folks who are sort of have multiple aspects of neurodivergence, and so quite often sort of like those things would mask each other. So a lot of what people would look for is sort of stereotypical ADHD traits in me didn't appear because of autistic traits. And when it came to autistic traits, I would often mask and hide those. So on the outset, I didn't necessarily fit the sort of what people were looking for, I suppose. But the thing that sort of really changed for me was actually sort of where I learned of the diagnosis was that I was working with a number of coworkers who were also identified and diagnosed around the same time I was, and we sort of had this realization of like, oh, gee, we have a lot of things in common, and from there, that was sort of part of my journey.
That's really interesting that you say that your the two conditions kind of help to mask each other. So I have an ADHD diagnosis. I don't have an autism diagnosis, but I have a lot of traits. And I was talking to my mum about this the other day, and she was like, "You don't have autism." And I said, "I do. I think I do. I really do. Like some of the things that make me who I am, I have always masked. Like I'm really uncomfortable. I'm really awkward. I have a lot of sensory problems. I have really, really bad, like, things like noises and like earlier on, I was making toast. And this is a very ADHD thing, but also it was kind of like an ADHD but autism thing that happened. And if you don't watch food for that long, it can very easily burn. And we've got a new toaster. So I put the toast in, put it down to work, and then it popped up and I was like, oh, it's not done. So I put it back down again. And of course, it only really needed half a round. It didn't need a whole round. And then I got it out. It was blacker than black. And then I was in the middle of recording a TikTok, and all of a sudden the fire alarm went off. And I'm like, and yeah, I was just, that's a prime example of ADHD meets autism. Like, just like 1 minute being like, oh my God, I'm such an idiot because I burnt the food. And then like having a proper meltdown because there's a loud noise in my ear. Like, just it's really interesting. And I think you are really right there that, the two conditions can very much kind of impose over each other so that you don't notice as much. And I hadn't really thought of that. So that's been my takeaway from today. Very eye-opening. So in terms of your let's talk about your membership a bit, because I want to know like a bit more about it, like what was the idea behind it, and how does it help people?
Yeah, sure. So the primary way that it helps people is learning strategies
Mm,
and learning strategies that are applicable in business. So, for example, a lot of folks with ADHD might pursue medication as an option. However, medication can help you with a lot of things. It can't help you with that sort of feeling of being stuck between two business ideas and staring at
oh,
those two business ideas for
right.
months and months and months on end, and working on a little bit, and maybe working on it for a few months and then changing and hopping to a different idea without ever launching anything, right? However, so that's a very common experience of adults with ADHD. So the primary thing that it helps people is sort of strategies of working through things like making decisions between multiple offers in our businesses,
Mm,
strategies for things like completing projects, of like what are actual ways, how do we actually complete larger projects so that we don't continue to find ourselves at places that are 80% of the way there, because a lot of the strategies that might work really well for neurotypical people and that you find in sort of like a lot of project management literature don't actually really work that well for folks with ADHD. And the thing that holds us back can be the lack of effective strategy. So like thinking about like in the context of a business example, a very common strategy that I teach members that usually results in quick wins for folks who are newly diagnosed is about thinking about project success by trying to reduce the stakes of whatever you're doing.
yeah.
And so what a very common approach, this sort of a suggestion that we often get, that's very neurotypical advice, is along the lines, if you have a business idea, here's what you should do. You should write out like the 100 million things that need to be done, put that in an ordered list, sit down, like plan out the next few months and go through that list in order. And you're going to knock through that list until it's done, and then you'll have something that is live. And then the challenges for folks who are ADHD, where that can hold us back. One is we write out the 100,000 things on one list, and now we're overwhelmed with the list, and we're not starting because
Yeah.
we can't look at the list. Another is that like when we can spend months and months and months on working with something prior to having results, we can inadvertently be raising the stakes for ourselves, that we have this sense of like, it has to work, because if it doesn't work, I've just wasted 3 months, and like I can't go back, and I can't go back to the job, I can't do those other things. So like quite often strategies that are more effective with folks with ADHD and completing projects, for example, are thinking about sort of like the core of whatever the project you're building is, and trying to, as fast as possible, get to your first customer, get to your first sale, helping somebody. Maybe you're just building something. It's not necessarily the final model of your business, but you're starting something where you're sort of proving the concept, so that we're giving ourselves sort of evidence. We're giving
Mm,
ourselves clarity about how the project can unfold, so that we're starting to like work in shorter cycles where we work, we see a result, next cycle we work, we see a result, next cycle, of like constant improvement, as opposed to one big long cycle of where we do months and months and months and months and months of work and then do the big grand launch, and maybe find ourselves in a spot where we're holding back because we've raised the stakes so much that we find ourselves in a spot where we feel like we absolutely have to succeed or else, and then we go into perfectionism and iterating and things like that. So like that's an example of the types of like medication can't help us with those types of things. Reading books on productivity, if they're not made for ADHD, can't always help you with those types of things. So it's trying to find like the very realistic ways to approach changing how we work so that it best matches our style.
And that's so important. And you've just made me think about my own, like one of my own services. So with Mad About Money app, we have been looking at launching a membership, like a subscription service for the last 3 months. And both Vix and I, my co-founder, we both have ADHD. And we've got a whole list of the things that we need to have in it. But because it's such a big list of the things that we need to have in it, we
Yeah,
haven't started it yet, and therefore we've not launched it. And then we've also got the other problem that we
exactly.
can't accept payments in the app. And I'm thinking, actually, the best way to do this is find like a small group of people to help us to test it out. So we know that we've got people there, which motivates us to actually do the thing. Then we do the thing, we charge them like a minimal amount so that they can be the first people in the membership. They get to stay at that level. And then we just gradually drip feed stuff in. And then when we're at a point where there's more stuff in there, then we can go, right, we're ready to launch it now. But at least we're starting it. Ezra,
Yeah,
you are a
yeah,
genius.
exactly. Yeah. So, and that was, by the way, the primary way that I help folks is through my program called the ADHD Entrepreneur Hub, which is a low cost. It's a $7 a month program. There are now 1,300 entrepreneurs, which was also, by the way, sort of practice what I preach, built on something very similar of starting from that spot of saying, what value can I deliver that is worth far and beyond $7? And what we might find is that in order to get started, the best way to get started isn't to sit at our desk and to sort of continue to iterate and continue to sort of add and add and add and add and add and never get to the launch. The fastest way is sometimes to start
Yeah,
working with
right.
people as soon as possible. You will learn much more about how to help people by actually helping them than you will at sitting at your desk. And it also sort of, it gives us the feedback that we need to maybe keep going. So it's those types of strategies, or strategies of like how to organize your time and your day when you have, it's one thing to say, a very common advice for folks with ADHD is to sort of just focus on the things that interest you. But how do you deal with that reality when you're going to be doing a lot of stuff in business that doesn't interest you? Of like, you still have to make all of those things happen. So like those types of strategies as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that is fabulous advice. How do people find your program and sign up for it?
Yeah, so you could Google the ADHD Entrepreneur Hub. And again, like I'm very like I really do want to lean into part of building the ADHD Entrepreneur Hub. So to Google is the easiest place to find it, was based upon sort of my own experience of trying to learn some of these skills. And what I ended up having to do is I worked with three coaches that I worked with quite intensively, who, they were ADHD coaches, and I paid them like $2,000 each. One of them was absolutely awesome, and two of them not so much. And my thought was, I don't want folks to go through that same experience. I think the easier way to do it is to build a community where people can learn the skills. It's affordable, so that if it's a great fit for you, then that's great. And if we're not a great fit to work together, I deliberately want that to be okay too, so that we're building a community of folks who are that for everyone it's a win-win.
Love that. Ezra, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much. Are you on social media platforms? Where's the best place for
Yeah,
people to
yeah,
follow
you
you?
can find me on most socials by Googling ADHD Tools, or by searching
Amazing.
ADHD Tools.
Thank you so much for coming on. So everybody, if you've been listening to this on Apple Music or Spotify or YouTube, you are in the wrong place, because you can download Mad About Money app for free and you can listen there instead. If you've not heard of Mad About Money before, it is a money hub for neurodivergent people, whether you're a parent or an entrepreneur, or you're in the workplace. Whatever your situation, we help you to understand your finances better, and also all of the other areas that go into your money as well. So like your health and well-being, your work life, like all of the stuff. So it's a really cool place to hang out, and it's currently free because we haven't worked out how the hell to monetize it yet. So that's coming very, very soon. I've been Maddy Alexander-Grout. I probably still will be tomorrow as well. So you can find me on LinkedIn. And thanks for watching. We will see you next time.